the spark of Ruth Handler. In the midst of the creative bustle that defined life in post-war United States, when families were trying to rebuild routines and the streets of Los Angeles mixed the smell of hot asphalt with the rising sound of television that was already beginning to set trends, Ruth Handler appears as a figure who does not yet know she is about to change the history of toys and global entrepreneurship. 1956 moves with a particular rhythm, and in that era when gender roles are firmly established and the children's entertainment industry still follows very rigid patterns, Ruth watches her daughter Barbara play on the floor with paper dolls that she dresses, undresses and imagines as adult women traveling through scenes that exist only in her mind. That simple gesture stops her, because something in that game allows her to see a space that the market has ignored for decades, a gap that no one seems willing to explore, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of inertia, or perhaps because it requires the gaze of someone who does not fear questioning what everyone considers normal. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from which place in the world and at what time you join us tonight. I would love to read you in the comments. Having said that, let us return to that crucial moment in the Handler household, because there begins to take shape an idea that in a short time would shake an entire industry. Ruth has spent years understanding the market from within. Alongside her husband Elliot, she has built Mattel practically from nothing, facing fierce competition, lack of resources, and the doubts of those who believed that the toy business was merely a manufactured pastime for housewives. She has learned to look beyond the obvious. She knows how to identify margins, detect gaps in demand, and anticipate what a child might desire, even before that desire takes form. That capacity, sharpened by years of struggle and experimentation, rises with force when she observes the contrast between what her daughter imagines and what the market offers. Because at that time, girls only have access to baby dolls, toys destined to perpetuate the role of caretakers, figures that represent a limited future and never an independent or aspirational adult life. Barbara's fascination with paper dolls is not a childish whim. It is the sign of a latent desire in many girls of the era, a desire to play at being older, to project themselves beyond their immediate surroundings. And it is there where Ruth realizes that the toy world has remained frozen in a vision that no longer fits the changing society that is beginning to take shape in the post-war years. She understands that girls do not only seek to nurture, but to imagine themselves as women with professions, with style, with their own voice. That intuition, which for others might sound excessively modern for the time, becomes a silent obsession that begins to accompany her for weeks, slipping into her thoughts during meetings, family meals, and creative discussions with the Mattel team. The company, however, is not in a moment of excesses or unnecessary risks. Mattel is still consolidating, trying to survive in a market in which innovation is often punished quickly if it fails. The toys they manufacture up to that point work well, but they have not yet achieved that iconic product that transforms the company into a true reference. Elliot, more cautious, fears that an adult doll could be perceived as something inappropriate, too bold for traditional families. Many employees share that doubt. Some even dare to suggest that the idea could become a disastrous failure. Even so, Ruth continues reflecting on that moment with her daughter, convinced that there is a powerful sign there that she cannot ignore. The internal process she undergoes in those days is intense and deeply personal, because she understands that entrepreneurship consists not only of having a good idea, but of recognizing when an intuition can become a path capable of transforming an entire sector. If something defines Ruth Handler, it is not prudence, but the ability to take risks when instinct tells her that something can work. She knows that the companies that mark a before and after do not prosper by copying what exists, but by daring to break molds and challenge the expectations of the public, even when that public is not explicitly asking for change. As she reflects on what she has witnessed in her living room, she begins to articulate a revolutionary notion. A doll that represents an adult woman, with a stylized body and a modern appearance, something completely removed from the traditional plastic babies that crowd store shelves. It is not only about manufacturing a different doll, it is about offering girls a narrative tool, a support for imagining possibilities. And that idea, in its earliest form, has enormous potential, although no one else sees it yet. Ruth then begins to think about how to present the proposal within Mattel without provoking an immediate rejection. She imagines the design, the way it could be introduced to the public, and the materials required to produce it on a large scale. She even visualizes the advertising strategy, aware that such a novel concept will require a compelling narrative to overcome the initial doubts of parents, distributors, and competitors. All that mental process merges with daily life, with the noise of the factory, with the endless meetings, and with the pressure of ensuring that Mattel not only survives, but grows in a saturated market. In those days, Ruth still does not have the final prototype, nor the defined strategy, but she already possesses something even more important, an inner certainty that gains strength with each new thought. The toy world is ready for a revolution, even if no one else knows it yet, and she is willing to initiate it from the least expected place, the imagination of a girl who plays in her living room. As the idea matures and settles in Ruth's mind, the story begins to move toward a scenario that will soon take her much further than she imagines in that moment. Because what she still does not know is that, by following that intuition, she will undertake a journey that will cross oceans and confront her with a discovery that will act as the detonator for everything that is to come. And it is there where our story continues, on a path that will carry this vision until it finds its first physical form. From a German doll to an icon. When the idea of a doll with a woman's body settles fully in Ruth Handler's mind, life does not pause to give her space. Mattel's schedule remains filled with meetings, suppliers, production adjustments, and constant pressure to stay competitive. And in the middle of that routine appears the opportunity to travel to Europe, to attend trade fairs, to see what is moving in other markets, and, above all, to observe with her own eyes whether somewhere in the world someone has dared to create, even in a rudimentary way, what she imagines for American girls. Europe, in the mid-1950s, is still living with the consequences of the post-war years, but it is also beginning to breathe a different cultural air, something bolder, more ironic, less tied to traditional family morals. And that contrast between continents is crucial to understanding what is about to happen. On one of those German streets, in front of the window of a shop selling toys and souvenirs, Ruth suddenly stops, because among trinkets, small, decorative objects, and figurines for adults, something immediately catches her attention. A slender doll with a confident expression on her face, a perfectly styled hairstyle, and a stylized body that looks nothing like the plastic babies that fill the shelves in the United States. This doll is called Build Lily, born from a comic strip aimed at an adult audience, and it was not created with children in mind. However, in Ruth's gaze, an instant connection appears between what she sees in that display window and what her daughter Barbara embodied when she played on the living room floor, with paper dolls turned into imaginary women. It is in that crossing of images, between the domestic scene and the European storefront, that the vision begins to take tangible shape. Lily's figure, with her sophisticated air, her striking outfits, and her satirical origin, embodies a different culture, more uninhibited, and even provokes some scandal in certain sectors because she is associated with a mischievous sense of humor and a type of femininity seen as provocative for the standards of the time. Ruth, however, does not remain trapped in that cultural context. Her entrepreneurial gaze cuts through the surface and focuses on the structure of the product. An adult body, articulated, meant for posing in different outfits, with a face that moves away from the infantile expression and approaches the young woman that girls visualize when they dream of growing up. She understands that, in its current state, this doll would not fit in the living room of a traditional American family, but she recognizes in its lines the perfect raw material to build something different, something that can adapt to another language, another narrative. Instead of observing it as a simple foreign curiosity, Ruth enters the shop and buys several units. She does not settle for just one, because she knows that upon returning to California, she will need to analyze every detail calmly, disassemble the doll, study the proportions, the materials, the production possibilities. This gesture, which from the outside may seem impulsive, is in reality a strategic move, typical of someone who understands that inspiration must be captured immediately before it dissolves among everyday pending tasks and urgencies. She leaves the shop with the feeling that she carries in the bag a key clue, a bridge between the intuition born in her living room and a real product, however imperfect it may be, for her final objective. Back at Mattel, the dolls become the object of almost forensic analysis. The design and engineering team places them on the table, observes them, takes measurements, and openly discusses their potential and their risks. There are those who are fascinated by the idea of an adult figure that allows experimentation with clothing, accessories, and styles, because that opens a huge range of commercial possibilities, especially in the realm of fashion, a space to which girls of the time can only access through magazines or through their mothers' closets. Others, however, show clear resistance, pointing out Lily's origin, the overly suggestive tone of some of her designs, and the difficulty of convincing parents and distributors that a doll inspired by an adult comic strip has a place in children's rooms. It is in those meetings that the difference becomes clear between a conservative business person who thinks only of minimizing risks and a visionary entrepreneur willing to reconfigure the context so the idea can succeed. Ruth listens to all the objections, but she does not experience them as a wall. She sees them as a map of the adjustments that must be made for the concept to become acceptable. She understands that it is not a matter of replicating Lily, but of transforming that foundation into something new. A product with its own soul, adapted to American sensibilities, to the narrative she wants to build for girls, and to the commercial demands of Mattel. A process of creative and strategic translation begins, in which the German doll stops being a simple model and becomes the starting point of a complete redesign. The body proportions are reconsidered to make them less provocative and closer to the stylized ideal that, in the mindset of the time, could be associated with a young model. The facial expression is softened, the hairstyle is crafted to convey sophistication without falling into caricature. An internal structure is designed that can be mass-produced without costs skyrocketing, because an iconic toy cannot depend on inaccessible materials if it intends to reach millions of homes. Every technical decision responds to a deeper question. What kind of woman do we want this doll to represent in the eyes of a girl who is still building her own idea of the future? While the design team works on the body and the face, other departments at Mattel focus on the peripherals that will turn the concept into a stable business. A line of interchangeable clothing, accessories aligned with the aspirational culture of the time, packaging that reinforces the message that this is a youthful, modern, fashion-related figure. At this point, Ruth's entrepreneurial mind shines again, because she is not thinking of an isolated toy, but of an entire system that multiplies the value of every purchase, turning the doll into the center of a universe that girls will want to expand birthday after birthday. However, beneath that creative effervescence lies an important concern: the boundary between inspiration and legal conflict. Build Lily is an existing product, with intellectual property behind it, with manufacturers and design rights. And although legislation in the 1950s does not operate with today's precision, the Mattel team understands that they cannot present themselves to the world with an obvious copy. That is why they strive to differentiate the design, to refine the shapes, to create a proposal that, even if born from a known base, has its own visual and conceptual personality. For Ruth, this aspect is also part of the entrepreneurial game, moving in a terrain where creativity dialogues with what is possible, without crossing lines that could destroy the project before it even takes off. As development progresses, the idea that began on the Handler family's living room floor and found an unexpected echo in a German shop window begins to gain defined contours. The doll is no longer Lily, but she is not yet the icon the world will know as Barbie. She is in that intermediate space in which a product is in transition, testing shapes, changing details, polishing what could be misinterpreted by the target audience. In every iteration, Ruth asks herself whether an American mother will see in this figure a threat to her daughter's innocence, or a different kind of play tool, capable of opening the door to new stories. The key moment arrives when she and the team decide that the time has come to stop treating the project as an internal experiment and to start seeing it as a real company bet. There are doubts, there is tension, and there is fear of rejection. But there is also a deep conviction that the children's market is ready, even if it does not know it yet, to receive a doll that represents another stage of life, one that serves as a mirror for different aspirations. That mixture of emotion and uncertainty can be felt in Mattel's hallways, in rushed conversations about strategy, and in the design of the first campaign that will accompany the doll when she faces the public. In the end, the decision is clear: to turn that European discovery into the skeleton of a new product, and to present it to the world with a defined identity, with a name of its own and a value proposition that breaks with the logic of traditional children's toys. The journey from the German shop window to the design table in California has been the first great voyage of this idea. a path that shows how an entrepreneur who knows how to read the signs of the market can find raw material in the most unexpected places. And with the prototype ready to leave anonymity behind, the next stage approaches, the definitive test before buyers, distributors, and the public, in a setting where there will no longer be room to hide doubts. 1959. Debut at the New York Fair. On the morning of the 9th of March of 1959, the weather in New York was cold, but inside the venue of the American International Toy Fair, the atmosphere boiled with rapid conversations, impeccable suits, half-closed deals, and vendors who, with a mixture of enthusiasm and fatigue, attempted to convince every buyer that this year their catalog was the one that deserved space on the shelves. Among board games, electric trains, stuffed animals, and the usual dolls, the stand of Mattel seemed, at first glance, just one more in the ocean of proposals, a corner crowded with boxes, samples, and rehearsed smiles. However, on one of the shelves, strategically illuminated, waited a figure that looked unlike anything the other exhibitors had brought. A doll with a slender body, a swimsuit of white and black stripes, a high ponytail, and a direct gaze, as if she knew she was about to alter the established order. That product, which Mattel presented under the description "teenage fashion model," was the result of all the internal debates, adjustments, and tensions that had accompanied Ruth Handler from her living room to the design workshop. The bet was clear. Instead of presenting her to the public as a mother or as a baby, the company had decided to position the doll as a young woman who served as a support for fashion, a sort of aspirational mannequin for girls who looked at their mother's magazines and dreamed of dresses, hairstyles, and impossible styles. The choice of words was not a minor detail. In a market where sensitivities were deeply marked, the way of naming a product could determine the difference between enthusiasm and frontal rejection. While professional buyers walked through the aisles with catalogs under their arms, price lists, and predefined objectives, many stopped before Mattel's novelty with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They were accustomed to baby dolls, to childlike figures associated with the game of caring and feeding. So encountering a doll with curves, a defined waist, a pronounced chest, and an attitude more fitting of a model than a traditional toy shattered in an instant the mental scheme they had about what was supposed to be sold to a 9-year-old girl. Some smiled with condescension, others frowned, and some looked at her as if she were a passing extravagance that would end up relegated to a forgotten corner of the inventory. Ruth, however, knew that the moment required more than placing the doll on a shelf and waiting for a miracle to occur. Behind the figure in the swimsuit, there was a carefully prepared strategy. The design of the packaging, with a stylized box that presented the doll almost as a luxury object. The selection of the first sets of clothing, from evening dresses to casual outfits, conceived to show the variety of styles that could be created. And, above all, a decision that at the time was revolutionary in the toy industry. The massive investment in television advertising aimed directly at children, not at parents. Mattel had understood that the New York Fair was only the first stage of a much more ambitious campaign. The real battle would take place in the living rooms of homes in the United States, before the glow of the television screen, when girls saw, during the commercial breaks of the most popular children's program of the moment, a figure who moved in a world of fashion, glamour, and possibilities. The company was willing to dedicate an important part of its budget to advertisements in the Mickey Mouse Club, which, for many competitors, seemed excessive, even reckless, because television was still consolidating itself as an advertising medium for toys, and there were no guarantees of return. In that context, the fair fulfilled two functions. On one hand, it made it possible to close agreements with distributors and retailers. On the other, it served as a thermometer of the initial reaction of the market. The buyers walked among the displays, listened to the sales pitch of Mattel's representatives, who insisted that girls would be fascinated by the possibility of dressing and redesigning their doll again and again, and some doubted that mothers would easily accept an adult figure as a play companion for their daughters. Some said that the doll looked too mature, too sophisticated, something that clashed with the idea of childlike innocence that many sought to protect. What is interesting is that, while adults focused on this possible inappropriateness, Ruth and her team trusted that, as soon as girls saw the product outside the context of the fair, the connection would be immediate. The key lay in understanding that the final user and the purchaser do not look at the same object in the same way. Parents analyzed morality, tradition, and price, while girls, upon seeing Barbie on television or in a shop window, would read in that stylized body a promise of stories, imagined futures, scenes that could extend far beyond the cradle and bottle. In business terms, the launch was structured as a system. The doll had a price accessible enough to enter many homes, but the true construction of revenue lay in the catalog of clothing and accessories that accompanied her. Each dress, each pair of shoes, each work or party outfit was conceived as a small expansion of the girl's narrative universe, a constant incentive to expand the collection and thereby strengthen the emotional connection with the brand. Mattel understood that if it succeeded in turning Barbie into a blank canvas on which each girl could project her own story, the buying cycle would become recurrent, almost natural. Throughout the days of the fair, reactions varied. There were buyers who went from initial mockery to genuine interest upon hearing the plans for television marketing and the aspirational focus of the doll. Others remained skeptical, convinced that parents would not allow the entry of an adult figure into the child's bedroom. And yet, when the first orders began to arrive and the television campaign began to run, something occurred that changes the destiny of a company. Girls began to request Barbie by name, directly, clearly, persistently. The stores that had doubted encountered something that the fair had not measured fully: an upward pressure from the final consumer. In the aisles, the little ones pointed to the box with the doll in the striped swimsuit, repeated the name they had heard on television, asked for more clothes, more colors, more options. In very little time, the product that some had labeled as too risky became a sales phenomenon, with hundreds of thousands of units distributed in the first year and an increasingly strong presence in popular culture. For Mattel, and especially for Ruth, that first success was not merely a number in the accounting books or a punctual marketing triumph, but the confirmation that the initial intuition had been correct. Girls wanted to play at being older, to imagine themselves in different lives, to explore a future that was not limited to the role of mother or caregiver. Barbie was born surrounded by controversy, with defenders, detractors, and intense opinions, but that noise was precisely the signal that the product had touched a deep chord, that it was not just another toy on an overcrowded shelf, but the beginning of a social conversation that would continue for decades. From that moment on, the question was no longer whether Barbie would work as a toy, because the market had confirmed it with facts, but how to build around her a solid structure, an environment that would prevent her from fading as a passing trend and that, instead of extinguishing itself, would grow and expand toward new play spaces, characters, and scenarios. And that new stage, which would lead the doll to stop being alone in her box and instead be surrounded by an entire universe created for her, would become the next great strategic movement in the history of the brand. The 1960s, building a Barbie world. At the beginning of the decade of the 1960s, the United States was living the golden age of the suburbs, of houses with impeccable facades, of household appliances as symbols of progress and of cars parked in front of brand new garages, and Barbie, newly arrived on the market, fit perfectly into that aspirational landscape that blended consumption, lifestyle, and middle-class dreams. Mattel understood very quickly that the doll had ceased to be a risky experiment and had become a product capable of sustaining complete lines of business, so the focus was no longer solely on selling a doll, but on building around her a complete universe in which each girl could develop different stories, with characters, settings, and accessories that extended the play experience over the course of years. The first important move in that expansion came in 1961, when Mattel introduced Ken, the boyfriend of Barbie, a figure that appeared with a very clear purpose. It was not about creating an alternative protagonist, but about adding a piece that enriched the narrative and opened the way to new sets of clothing, romantic scenes, trips, parties, dances, and situations that multiplied the range of possible stories. Ken was not born to overshadow Barbie, but to orbit around her and reinforce her centrality as the axis of play, and that decision says a great deal about the vision of Ruth Handler, who always imagined the main product accompanied by elements that strengthened it without displacing it. From a business standpoint, this meant that every new character had to justify its existence through additional sales linked to the core of the brand. As the decade advanced, Mattel understood that if it wanted to solidify Barbie as something more than a passing trend, It needed to translate into physical objects, the aspirations that dominated the culture of the moment. In 1962 came the first Barbie dream house, a house that, seen with current eyes, may seem simple, with cardboard furniture and a basic modular design, but that in its time represented something very powerful. The idea of a space of her own for Barbie. A home where she lived alone, without parents, without authority figures dictating her steps, which in the context of the early 60s was already a silent declaration of female independence. That house was not merely an accessory. It was a setting that transformed the type of stories that girls could tell. Because now, Barbie could organize parties, receive visitors, choose her decoration, and move through an environment designed specifically for her. From the standpoint of business, the dream house introduced a key concept that many digital entrepreneurs would recognize decades later: the ecosystem. The doll was no longer sold on her own. Every new product line was conceived to interact with the previous ones, reinforcing the sense of continuity and belonging to a coherent world. The cars that began to appear, the wardrobes filled with interchangeable clothing, the accessories for the beach or the city, all responded to a logic in which Barbie acted as the central platform and the rest of the elements functioned as extensions of that platform. In this way, every additional purchase increased the perceived value of the previous purchases, because the collection did not grow in isolation, but by fitting pieces into the same narrative. In 1964, Skipper appeared, the younger sister of Barbie, and with her Mattel refined even more the segmentation of play, introducing a figure that allowed girls to represent family dynamics, scenes of care and complicity between sisters and, at the same time, opening a commercial door toward younger consumers who did not yet feel represented in the adult figure of Barbie. Every new character responded to a specific need: more possibilities for storytelling, more clothing options, more moments of shared play among girls of different ages who could identify with different characters within the same universe. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this was a perfect example of how a solid brand could diversify without diluting itself, as long as it maintained a clear and coherent center. While all these characters and accessories were added to the catalog, Mattel strengthened a tool that had already been key in the launch of Barbie: television advertising. The commercials were filled with scenes in which Barbie drove her convertible, walked alongside Ken, organized parties in her house, or prepared for an important date, while the slogan insisted on the number of possible lives the girl could invent through play. Television became a kind of emotional instruction manual that did not explain concrete rules, but suggested atmospheres and situations that the girls replicated and transformed in their bedrooms. Every commercial was, in reality, a reminder that something was always missing to complete the Barbie world. A new garment, a piece of furniture, an accessory that the commercial placed at the center of desire. At the same time, the printed catalogs that accompanied the dolls and accessories became a quiet tool of loyalty building. Many girls sat down to leaf through those small full-color magazines, where outfits were displayed that they perhaps could not yet buy, but that became medium-term goals, desired birthday gifts, objectives that kept them connected to the brand. Those catalogs were, in essence, an early form of what we would today call community building. They created a common language, a shared imaginary and a mental list of what comes next that nurtured the long-term relationship between consumer and product. It is impossible to understand the expansion of Barbie in the 1960s without connecting that phenomenon to the social climate of the era. While marketing presented her as a model, perfect hostess of parties, beach girl, or sophisticated young woman who inhabited a very tidy house, outside of the commercials, the decade was filled with social movements, early waves of female demands, and profound cultural changes. Mattel moved within that delicate balance. On the one hand, it took advantage of the ideal of elegance and style that fit the dreams of the middle class. And on the other, it began, timidly, to experiment with professions and activities that suggested a life beyond the home. Barbie appeared as a student, as a worker in certain environments, and opened small cracks in the traditional narrative, even though she did not yet reach the level of professional ambition that would be seen later. From a business perspective, what was relevant here was how the brand learned to partially read the social context, incorporating changes at its own pace, without abruptly breaking with the imaginary that had made it popular. Mattel knew that its consumer lived between what she saw on television and what she was beginning to hear in the streets, between the ideal of domestic perfection and the first discourses of change, and used Barbie as a bridge between both worlds, a figure who could be the perfect hostess in her dream house and, at the same time, flirt with the idea of a more autonomous life. That ability to adjust the narrative without losing the essence was what maintained the interest of the girls and allowed Barbie to avoid becoming trapped in a single decade. While the brand harvested this success, it was also preparing, almost without realizing it, to face a new challenge. That of a society that would begin to demand more representation, more types of beauty, more ways of being in the world. The universe that Mattel built around Barbie during the 1960s became the foundation on which intense debates would be fought in the next stage, when diversity would cease to be a marginal issue and would begin to enter toys, television, and family conversations. 70s and first steps towards diversity. At the beginning of the 1970s, the United States was going through a period of profound transformation. The Vietnam War was in its final chapters. Student movements were stirring the universities, music was expanding cultural horizons, and television was beginning to show a society less uniform than previous decades had suggested. In that turbulent and stimulating context, Barbie faced a silent challenge. Remaining relevant in a world that no longer viewed femininity through the same lens, a world where girls were growing up surrounded by new discourses, new role models, and a sensitivity more open to plurality. Mattel, after a decade in which it had consolidated the Barbie universe with houses, cars, clothing, and secondary characters, understood that the brand needed to evolve if it hoped to continue being the play companion of millions of girls. The children's market was increasingly demanding, and the competition was beginning to move with cleverness, so the company needed to offer something that responded to the cultural climate without diluting the essence of the doll. In that field of subtle tensions, where every change could be received as progress or provocation, the brand made decisions that would shape the public perception of Barbie for generations. One of the most emblematic transformations of this stage was the birth of Malibu Barbie in 1971, a doll that did not come from a professional, elegant, or urban context, but from the beach, with a more relaxed style, a marked tan, and a personality that fit the carefree spirit of California. This shift toward a beach aesthetic did not intend to break with the previous identity, but to update it in order to align with the fashion, the music, and the lifestyle that were beginning to dominate among the youth. Malibu Barbie conveyed freshness, freedom, and a vibrant energy that connected with the pop culture of the time and allowed the brand to breathe a different air, less formal, and closer to the idea of personal enjoyment. However, while aesthetics evolved, society was beginning to pose a deeper conversation: the need for representation. More and more families belonged to diverse communities with African American, Latin, and Asian roots, and the media were timidly beginning to show that plurality. Barbie, with her traditionally white and blonde image, stood before a frontier that needed to be crossed carefully. Mattel had already begun experimenting with modest steps toward diversity in the late 1960s, when in 1968 it launched Christy, an African American friend of Barbie who appeared as an important figure within the protagonist's social circle. Christy was not an anecdotal figure, nor an accessory without purpose. Her presence showed the company's initial willingness to reflect an evolving society. Even so, the toy industry, like so many others, was advancing slowly in this field. The lines separating innovation, cultural sensitivity, and commercial risk were narrow, and Mattel needed to balance each decision with extreme care. Christie's presence was a necessary step, but something fundamental was still missing: offering versions of Barbie that did not limit themselves to the skin tone and hair that had dominated the brand since its creation. That transition began to take shape in the early 1980s, when the first African American and Hispanic Barbie dolls with their own names and distinctive features appeared, although the essence of the process was already germinating in the 70s. During these years, the brand also began introducing changes in the professions that Barbie represented. Girls were no longer satisfied with having their dolls live only in a domestic or beach setting. They wanted to see them in scenarios where they could be students, athletes, workers, or explorers. Mattel understood this need as an opportunity to reinforce the idea that Barbie was not just an aesthetic figure, but a narrative tool for imagining possible futures, something that fit naturally with the cultural climate of the decade, when women were beginning to claim their labor, social, and political space with greater strength. Each new set, each profession, and each secondary character had a clear objective: to expand the atmosphere of play, to offer windows into other ways of living, to push the limits of what girls could visualize within the Barbie experience. On a business level, it was an intelligent way to enrich the catalog without losing the fundamental coherence of the brand. On a social level, it was an indirect way of participating in the conversation about the role of women in a changing world. But the path toward diversity is never linear. While Barbie was beginning to open space for different skin tones and lifestyles, the brand was also receiving criticism for remaining within aesthetic limits that were too narrow. Many parents, educators, and psychologists pointed out that Barbie's figure represented an unattainable body, an idealized image that could generate insecurities in impressionable girls. Mattel became aware of these debates, although at that time it was not yet prepared for a radical transformation in the doll's proportions. The company was learning to navigate between market demands, cultural changes, and the challenge of remaining relevant without losing its identity, a balance that few brands managed to maintain over time without wearing down. Despite the tensions and contradictions, the 1970s left a clear legacy for Barbie: the need to adapt to social changes while maintaining a stable narrative core. The expansion toward diversity and the aesthetic update were steps that, although discreet in that moment, marked a turning point that would make possible the great reinvention that would arrive decades later. The doll was beginning to cease being a single and linear reflection, and was becoming a more flexible surface where different cultures and aspirations could find representation. With this shifting landscape, the arrival of new trends, new competitors, and new questions about Barbie's role in society was just around the corner, and the brand would have to prepare to enter a much more complex period where public expectations would begin to rise significantly. The 80s. Marketing, luxury, and pink excess. When the decade of 1980 begins, the world enters a kind of permanent spectacle. Shoulder pads become enormous, hair expands with hairspray, shopping malls grow like cathedrals of consumption, and television becomes a continuous showcase of advertisements that promise brighter, faster lives filled with more things. And Barbie fits into that scenery as a character who had been preparing for this moment for years, because her aspirational essence finds in the 80s the perfect stage to exaggerate itself, to become more sophisticated, and to multiply to the limit. Mattel detects very early that the decade breathes excess, that pop culture values shine, luxury, and theatricality. So it decides to take the Barbie brand to a higher level, both in design and in marketing, and the doll begins to wear impossible party dresses, extremely high hairstyles, intense makeup, and accessories that seem taken from music video clips, all designed to amplify the sensation of glamour and to turn each new line into a small spectacle of pink, sequins, and fantasy. The brand makes it clear that it wants to dominate the toy aisle, but it also wants to slip into the adult imagination as a pop symbol, an object that not only entertains girls but represents a recognizable aesthetic, almost a visual signature. In this context, collaborations with real fashion designers appear, elevating the doll to another level. Names like Oscar de la Renta signed special collections for Barbie, which, from a business perspective, has a very interesting double effect. On one hand, it grants prestige to the brand, connecting it with the world of high fashion and legitimizing its link with style. On the other, it brings it closer to the adult public, who begins to see it as a collectible object, something that transcends children's play and transforms into a display piece. For an entrepreneur, this movement is a clear lesson. When a product manages to occupy two segments at the same time, the children's segment and the collector's segment, its growth potential multiplies without needing to change the core of the design. The consecration of Barbie as a pop icon is reinforced when artists like Andy Warhol incorporate her image into their work, integrating her into that universe where mass consumption products become art, criticism, and symbols of an era. That a doll reaches the canvases of one of the most influential artists of the century is not a minor anecdote. It is proof that the brand has crossed a boundary. It is no longer simply a plastic toy. It is a cultural sign, a face that represents an idea of beauty, aspiration, and consumption recognizable anywhere in the world. Mattel understands this dimension and takes advantage of it, reinforcing a strategy in which every appearance of Barbie in prestigious spaces feeds the perception of value even on toy store shelves. Meanwhile, the marketing machinery operates at full power. Television advertisements become more elaborate, with catchy songs, choreographies, and scenographies that resemble the music video clips that dominate the programming of the era. Barbie is presented as a rock star, as a dancer, as a party woman, as a figure who will live experiences always surrounded by luxury and fun. The campaigns not only show the product, they build an emotional world that invites girls to feel part of that brilliant life, even if only in miniature. Every advertisement insists on a central idea. There is a set, a house, a car, or a perfect stage for every version of Barbie, and you can choose which one you want to live. The direct result of this strategy is an explosion of product lines. Nighttime Barbies appear, daytime Barbies, special editions for celebrations, dolls with outfits inspired by very specific trends, collections that change quickly to follow the frenetic rhythm of 80s fashion. For Mattel, this means working almost like a fast fashion brand applied to toys. Fast seasons, constant renewal, the sensation that there is always something new to discover. In business terms, the model encourages continuous repurchase and makes the doll the center of a recurring consumption habit. In narrative terms, it consolidates the image of Barbie as a figure in constant movement, always dressed for the occasion. This period is also characterized by international expansion. Barbie enters with force into markets in Europe, Latin America, Asia, and other corners of the world, adapting in some cases styles and advertising messages to local sensibilities, but maintaining an essence that is recognized at first glance. The logo, the dominant pink color, the stylized silhouette, the idea that the doll embodies an ideal of modern and glamorous life. Visual standardization plays a fundamental role. Every girl who sees Barbie in an advertisement or in a store in any country understands that she is facing the same universe that appears in movies, magazines, and catalogs. However, the same force that drives this success contains within it an important tension. The more Barbie's aesthetic is exaggerated, the more the pink, the shine, and the perfection are intensified, the easier it becomes for the doll to start being perceived as a caricature of herself, a figure far removed from the reality of the girls who hold her in their hands. The brand moves along a delicate edge. On one hand, that excess is part of the charm and is hypnotic for many consumers. On the other, it begins to generate critical comments in media and academic environments, where the image of woman being promoted, the type of beauty being normalized, and the expectations it can generate start being questioned. What is interesting from the perspective of entrepreneurship is that Mattel, in the midst of sales euphoria, begins to perceive these criticisms without completely stopping the machinery. The company takes note of social conversations, but it continues pushing the model that has proven so profitable, trusting that the brand value built over decades will allow it to withstand the impact of some controversies. It is a very common phenomenon in businesses that achieve a certain hegemony. When the product dominates the market, the temptation to keep doing more of the same is enormous, because the numbers continue to be favorable, at least in the short term. The decade of the 80s leaves Barbie in a paradoxical position. On one hand, she has consolidated herself as one of the most recognizable brands on the planet, with massive presence, a universe of products that extends far beyond the main doll, and a cultural prestige that places her in museums, galleries, and adult collections. On the other hand, that same visibility turns her into a perfect target for criticism, into a symbol onto which debates that go far beyond the toy are projected. Debates about gender, body, success, and consumption. At the core, this is the price of becoming an icon. Every decision stops being merely commercial and acquires a social dimension. By the end of the decade, the brand already senses that the future will demand more than party dresses and luxury collaborations. The girls who grew up with Barbie in the 70s and 80s become adolescents and adults who question the world around them. Feminist movements reorganize, and the media speak more and more about the working woman, the professional woman, the one who occupies spaces of power and decision. Barbie, that figure who has spent years spinning on a dance floor of glamour and pink excess, faces the need to rebuild herself as something more than a symbol of a perfect life. And it is in that moment that the brand prepares to move toward a territory that will be, at the same time, a natural evolution and the origin of even more intense controversies. Barbie goes professional and becomes controversial. By the late 1980 seconds, and early 1990 seconds. While the world was beginning to talk about globalization, about women entering universities and offices in growing numbers, and about an economy increasingly driven by knowledge, Barbie found herself standing in front of an uncomfortable mirror. For years, she had been the queen of glamour, the perfect hostess of parties, and the protagonist of a universe built around clothes, cars, and dream houses. But now the cultural context demanded a different kind of narrative, one in which girls could imagine themselves in an operating room, an airplane cockpit, a spacecraft, or even a political office, making decisions and occupying positions of power that had previously been reserved almost exclusively for men. Mattel, always connected to market research, social movements, and cultural trends, understood that the time had come to push Barbie into more professional territory roles that were more ambitious and admired by girls. The company began releasing versions of the doll that embodied jobs associated with curiosity and prestige. Dr. Barbie, Veterinarian Barbie, Engineer Barbie, Pilot Barbie, Astronaut Barbie. Each one with her specific outfit, carefully designed accessories, and an aura that communicated the idea that the star of the playroom could do far more than dress for a party. She could prepare to save lives, explore outer space, or run businesses. In essence, it was a brilliant strategic move. It preserved the aspirational nature of the brand, but redirected it toward personal and professional achievement. During this period, one especially symbolic figure emerged. Barbie as a candidate for the presidency of the United States, presented as a doll inviting girls to imagine themselves in the nation's highest political office. The mere act of placing Barbie in that role delivered a direct, powerful message. Power can also wear a dress, high heels, and perfectly styled hair. Authority and femininity are not mutually exclusive. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this type of launch demonstrates how a brand can appropriate a social conversation and return it to the market in the form of a product, transforming a cultural debate into a concrete commercial line. However, this shift toward professional roles did not eliminate the conflicts surrounding Barbie. If anything, it intensified them. The doll now lived in a zone of tension, where countless eyes watched her closely. On one side were those who saw her as a positive example, a tool that allowed girls to visualize diverse futures beyond strictly domestic roles. On the other side, voices pointed out an obvious contradiction. Barbie's body remained unchanged, her proportions still far removed from any realistic reference point, and that idealized image overlapped with professions that demand intellectual rigor and discipline. The result was the sense that the message continued to revolve around appearance, even when speaking of professional success. Marketing campaigns from the era portrayed Barbie entering operating rooms, offices, and laboratories, surrounded by work instruments but also by elegantly designed briefcases, immaculate shoes, and flawlessly styled hair. Many advertisements and product boxes reinforced the idea that she could be anything, a slogan that, from a child's perspective, carries enormous inspirational potential. Yet to critics it felt like a simplification, one that failed to confront the real obstacles women faced in those same professional fields. This ambiguity turned Barbie into a mirror, where each audience saw something different. Some saw encouragement, others saw a misleading fantasy. The controversy intensified in the early 1990 seconds with an episode frequently cited in discussions about the doll, the release of Teen Talk Barbie, a version that spoke when a button was pressed. Among her pre-recorded phrases was one that generated immediate outrage among educators and feminist groups. "Math class is tough." In a context where society was trying to motivate girls to study science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, tying Barbie to that message was interpreted as a step backward, a reinforcement of the stereotype that women struggle with numerical disciplines. Mattel was forced to react, removing the phrase and managing a reputation crisis that made clear how closely the brand was being scrutinized. From an entrepreneurial standpoint, this episode reveals the fragility that accompanies an icon attempting to update itself. A company capable of launching astronaut Barbies or political Barbies figures, supposedly encouraging professional ambition, could still make a messaging mistake that undermined those efforts. Not because the product was poorly designed, but because a single line of text exposed internal inconsistencies, cultural reflexes that had not yet been fully examined. The lesson for any brand creator is evident. The bigger and more influential a project becomes, the more essential it is to ensure that every detail aligns with the message it claims to uphold. Meanwhile, the conversation about Barbie's body persisted. Numerous studies, articles, and television debates analyzed the potential impact on children's self-esteem of a doll with impossible proportions. Comparisons, drawings, and statistics circulated, illustrating that if a real woman had Barbie's body, she could not even stand upright. Mattel faced these criticisms at a time when the brand was still extremely profitable, so the response was not an immediate redesign, but rather adjustments to the narrative. The company emphasized that Barbie was a fictional figure, not meant to be an exact reflection of reality, and reinforced the idea of the doll as a symbol of possibilities rather than a physical model to imitate. Ultimately, Barbie embodied the tension between two forces that any large-scale project eventually encounters: the desire to adapt to the times and the need to preserve what makes it recognizable. Drastically changing the doll's body would have meant breaking with decades of visual identity and assuming a significant commercial risk, so the company chose to first transform what Barbie did and said before altering her silhouette. More professions appeared, more scenarios of power, more narratives in which the protagonist worked, studied, traveled, and led, while the debate over her body continued to accumulate, waiting for the right moment to erupt more forcefully. Despite the controversies and missteps, the era of professional Barbie left behind something undeniably valuable. Millions of girls grew up seeing their doll wear a lab coat, an executive suit, or an astronaut helmet. In terms of representation, that matters. Toys do not determine anyone's destiny, but they function as symbols, as small pieces in the puzzle of what a person considers possible. And in that sense, Barbie helped expand the imagination of many future doctors, lawyers, architects, and entrepreneurs, even if she wrapped that message in an aesthetic that remained intensely colorful and stylized. However, while Mattel continued to bet on that combination of professional aspiration and glamour, the market was shifting in a more complex direction. New brands entered with more aggressive proposals. Youth culture fragmented. Girls began consuming different kinds of audiovisual content, and the gradual rise of video games and early digital technologies started to transform the nature of play. Barbie, professional, glamorous, controversial, was approaching, without realizing it, a stage in which her reign would no longer be unquestionable, and in which she would have to face rivals ready to challenge her place not only on store shelves but in the minds of an entire generation. The Lost Decade. Bratz, Screens, and Decline. When the calendar enters the 2000s, children's bedrooms are no longer ruled by the same quiet that once accompanied afternoons of dolls and board games. Tube televisions begin to lose ground to the first compact consoles, computers invade desks, mobile phones stop being objects used exclusively by adults, and the attention of girls becomes fragmented among many new stimuli competing for their time. In that saturated landscape, Barbie encounters something she had not experienced in decades. A direct rival, bold and perfectly adapted to the new cultural climate. It is the moment when the Bratz appear, with their large heads, exaggerated lips, urban clothing, and defiant attitude, and they provoke an earthquake that, for a time, Mattel underestimated. The Bratz are not born to be just another variant on the shelf, but to propose a complete alternative to the model that Barbie represents. Their aesthetic aligns with the culture of hip-hop, music videos, reality shows, everything that sounds fresh, irreverent, and contemporary to new generations. In contrast to Barbie's polished glamour, the Bratz look like girls who live on the street, who go to shopping malls, who listen to music with huge headphones, and who make no attempt to appear perfect in the classic sense. Girls who are beginning to enter predolescence see in them an attitude that connects better with the language of the time, with the fashion of low-rise pants, short tops, and exaggerated accessories seen on music channels and in youth magazines. Meanwhile, in the enormous offices of Mattel, Barbie continues to sustain a large part of the company's revenue, but the company detects that something is shifting. Market figures show that the Bratz are beginning to gain share at an accelerating pace, that many girls who once would have chosen Barbie now beg for the new dolls, and that the aspirational narrative is no longer being built around evening gowns and convertible cars, but instead is moving towards something closer to urban youth culture. The problem is that a brand that has been dominant for decades does not always react with the necessary speed when a daring competitor appears. Often it trusts that its history, its weight, and its recognition will be enough to stop the advance of any newcomer. Parallel to this disruption, girls' playtime changes radically. The emergence of portable consoles, the first video games aimed at female audiences, animated series featuring complex teenage characters, and the expansion of the internet transformed leisure into something far more hybrid. Barbie had begun to take steps into the digital world with websites and a few computer titles, but she did so from a logic still centered on her usual universe, without fully understanding that the narrative framework of Girls was moving to different spaces, where characters made decisions, explored virtual worlds, and consumed stories with a faster and more fragmented rhythm. As the 2000s advance, Barbie's sales begin to suffer. In some markets, the reports show worrying declines, while in others the curve flattens after decades of sustained growth. Mattel responds with a mixture of strategies that, with hindsight, reveal a difficulty in reading the root of the problem. On one hand, product lines are launched inspired by trends that suspiciously resemble the Bratz, in a clear attempt to approach the new urban style that is triumphing among girls. On the other hand, the company multiplies special editions, outfit changes, and accessory packs meant to reactivate consumer desire using formulas that had worked in previous decades. The conflict between Barbie and Bratz is not limited to the store shelf. It eventually moves into the courts, with cross-lawsuits involving copyrights, intellectual property, and contracts of designers who had worked for Mattel and later participated in the development of the new dolls. That legal battle stretches over years and consumes enormous amounts of energy and resources, and although at certain moments it seems that Mattel achieves partial victories, the public begins to form the perception that the company is more focused on defending its past than on building a radically new future for its flagship brand. This dynamic of legal reaction rather than creative offense is one of the common mistakes large corporations make when they feel their throne is threatened. While the attorneys' meetings multiply, the true battlefield lies in bedrooms, in birthday parties, in Christmas wish lists. There, the only question that matters is which doll better embodies what an 8, 9, or 10-year-old girl wants to project about herself. Many of them begin to perceive Barbie as a figure associated with the childhood of their older sisters or even their mothers, while the Bratz represent something that feels new, slightly forbidden, and full of personality. That perception is lethal for a brand that has always built itself as a symbol of modernity and aspiration, because suddenly it begins to feel like a relic of the past. In this context, Barbie finds herself trapped in a kind of no man's land, too loaded with history to transform overnight, yet increasingly pressured by a present that demands deep changes. Mattel launches experiments, product lines that try to update makeup, hairstyles, settings, even animated series attempting to connect with contemporary aesthetics. But many of these efforts lack a unified strategic vision. They feel like patches, like attempts to follow someone else's trends instead of proposing a new narrative from the brand's own identity. In addition, society itself begins to enter a phase of far more intense critical analysis regarding beauty standards and the messages conveyed by children's products. Criticisms of Barbie's unrealistic body, which had been accumulating for years in articles and debates, gain greater resonance in a moment when the media and organizations begin speaking more forcefully about eating disorders, aesthetic pressure, and the need for diverse models. Suddenly, the doll that for decades had been synonymous with modernity begins to appear in reports and documentaries as an example of a problematic ideal. The combination of fresh competition, a radical shift in children's entertainment, and a growing critical wave regarding the image she represents produces within Mattel a feeling rarely admitted publicly, but instantly recognized by any entrepreneur who has lived it. The intuition that the model that made you great is losing strength, and that you are not yet sure what to replace it with. Internal numbers, qualitative studies with mothers and daughters, results by region, everything begins pointing in the same direction. Barbie's shine is no longer unquestionable. This stage is often described as a lost decade for the doll, not because sales collapsed overnight, but because many of the company's strategic moves failed to rebuild the narrative and reconnect it with new generations. It is as if Barbie were going through an identity crisis in the middle of the digital era, trying to figure out whether her place is to remain the queen of plastic, to become a video game character, to migrate toward animation, or to reinvent herself as a symbol of different values. The answers arrive slowly, and meanwhile the competition continues expanding its territory. However, Even in the middle of this relative decline, the brand preserves something precious, an awareness that the problem is not only about sales, but about meaning. That idea, which at first appears faintly in a few research reports, begins to take shape until it becomes the starting point for a much deeper process of self-critique, one in which Mattel is forced to truly listen to those who for years had pointed out the limits of the Barbie model, from the girls who no longer recognize themselves in her to the mothers who opt for other toys with more realistic proportions. And it is precisely when the company begins paying serious attention to those uncomfortable voices that the door opens to a much bolder evolution in the next stage of the story. Listening to the market. When the sales reports begin to show, without sugarcoating anything, that Barbie no longer occupies the throne as comfortably as before, the meetings at Mattel stop being celebrations of a legacy and turn into intense diagnostic sessions, where charts, surveys, and qualitative studies are projected onto screens, while executives, creatives, and analysts try to decipher what exactly has changed in the minds of girls and their families. The atmosphere is uneasy. For decades, everything seemed to run on a kind of automatic pilot. New careers, new dresses, new cars were enough to renew the cycle, but now that formula has weakened, and repeating it is no longer sufficient. It is the moment when a company of that size must decide whether to simply optimize what it already knows or dare to question its own flagship product with a level of honesty rarely seen in large brands. The first serious step is to truly listen to those who have been talking about Barbie from outside the boardrooms for years. Mattel hires research firms, child psychologists, branding experts, and sociologists, and begins organizing focus groups with mothers, fathers, and girls in different countries. The sessions are recorded, transcribed, analyzed, line by line, searching for patterns that might help explain why new generations feel less connected to the doll. In those rooms, behind one-way mirrors, executives listen to girls who, while playing, verbalize ideas that wound the pride of any product team. She's pretty, but she looks like a toy from when my mom was little. None of my friends look like that. I like dolls that look like normal girls. Mothers, for their part, add another layer of information, blending memories with current concerns. Some say they grew up with Barbie and feel a mix of nostalgia and fondness, but at the same time hesitate to repeat the pattern with their daughters because they have now read articles about body image, watched documentaries that question beauty standards, or simply feel that there are healthier and more realistic alternatives on the market. Others talk about digital competition, about how their daughters spend more time in front of a screen than brushing a doll's hair, and point out something crucial. If Barbie wants to remain relevant, it isn't enough to sit on the shelf. She must connect with what these girls aspire to become in a world that no longer resembles the 1,990 seconds. At the same time, the company commissions broader quantitative studies, surveys of thousands of families in different markets that measure brand affinity, perceptions of modernity, cultural relevance. The results reveal a paradox that is hard to manage. Barbie remains enormously well known, almost everyone knows who she is, but that familiarity does not automatically translate into desire. The doll is deeply embedded in collective memory, and yet she is starting to lose strength in the present, which in brand terms means her symbolic capital is at risk of becoming a mere memory, something evoked fondly, but not purchased. Within Mattel, this research phase feels like a kind of corporate group therapy. Some resist accepting that the problem runs so deep, preferring to interpret the sales drop as a normal cycle, a temporary consequence of new trends entering the market. Others, however, acknowledge that the company has taken too long to react and see in the criticism an opportunity to reposition Barbie in a way that aligns more coherently with contemporary values. The turning point arrives when the data, testimonials, and external trends all begin to point in the same direction. The brand has become trapped in an ideal of beauty and life that no longer represents most girls, and if it wants to survive, it must rethink itself from the roots. As the analysis deepens, a strategically complex idea emerges. The issue is not only in the stories Barbie tells, but in the body that tells them. Girls talk about faces, hair, and clothing, but they also mention the impossible waist, the endless legs, the sense that her figure corresponds to no real woman in their world. Experts point out that the doll has always functioned as a symbol of fantasy. However, In a cultural moment where conversations about mental health, self-esteem, and inclusion are increasingly present, that fantasy begins to be perceived as harmful by a large portion of society. Mattel is forced to confront a question it had avoided for years. Is it sustainable to keep defending a design that has become the center of criticism? The internal discussion splits into several lines. On one hand, there is the fear of touching an icon. Changing Barbie's body is a risky move because her silhouette is etched into the memory of generations, has headlined campaigns, movies, art collections. Altering it might unsettle millions of consumers and collectors. On the other hand, the research teams insist that doing nothing would condemn the brand to slow irrelevance, a silent erosion in which the numbers drop a little more every year until the product becomes a shadow of what it once was. Between these pressures, a conclusion begins to filter through. The real danger is not in changing, but in arriving too late. In parallel with these reflections, Mattel begins exploring concrete proposals. Industrial designers and concept artists work on prototypes of dolls with different proportions, shorter, taller, wider, slimmer, with different skin tones and hair textures. These designs are tested in closed sessions. The reactions of girls from very diverse backgrounds are observed. Comments are collected, and sometimes they surprise with their bluntness. This one looks like my mom. This one could be my friend. This one looks like someone I see on the street. These apparently simple phrases are pure gold for a brand that has spent too long listening to abstract criticism and is now finally receiving practical clues about what a genuine update might mean. Meanwhile, the public conversation about diversity and inclusion intensifies across social media, traditional media, and academic spaces. Brands that understand the moment best begin to incorporate messages about body acceptance, different types of families, multiple identities. Mattel observes these shifts, aware that what's at stake is more than a pretty campaign. It is about aligning with a generation that values authenticity over superficial polish. In this context, continuing to present Barbie as a single kind of woman with a single body and a single ideal of beauty feels increasingly indefensible. All this listening and introspection gradually translates into a shift in mentality within the company. The doll stops being seen merely as a product expected to deliver quarterly profits and starts being understood as a vehicle of cultural influence that must be handled responsibly. This awareness does not appear overnight, but it eventually crystallizes in a key decision. The time has come to truly experiment with new bodies, new faces, new ways of existing in the world, and to do it in a way that does not feel like a public relations gesture, but a structural commitment. This stage of research and self-critique marks a turning point in the history of Barbie and Mattel, because it forces the company to face a truth many projects avoid for years. To remain relevant, sometimes you must accept that the product that made you great is no longer enough. From this moment on, the ideas that had sat on the table as hypotheses or isolated tests begin to take the shape of strategy, and the company prepares to take a step that for a long time seemed unthinkable: to modify the most recognizable figure in its entire catalog and open the door to a whole collection of dolls capable of representing far more diverse bodies and realities. The Fashionistas, revolution, and new bodies. When Mattel decides to make the definitive leap toward the physical transformation of Barbie, many years have already passed, filled with internal debates, reports pointing out the exhaustion of the classic model, and tense conversations between those who defend the legacy and those who insist that if the brand wants to remain alive, it must dare to touch what it had always considered untouchable. The key to this stage is that the decision does not come from a passing trend or an isolated impulse, but from a long process of listening, analyzing, and controlled testing that prepares the ground for an announcement that, once it becomes public, will travel around the world in a matter of hours. In the year 2016, after trials, prototypes, and a great deal of nerves, Mattel launches the Barbie Fashionistas line, a name that seems to refer only to clothing, but that actually hides one of the most strategic and risky product moves in the history of the company. Under that label appears a collection of dolls with different skin tones, different hairstyles, varied facial features, and, above all, bodies that finally move away from the single silhouette that had dominated for decades. Added to the traditional proportions are three new body types: curvy, petite, and tall, meaning a Barbie with more pronounced curves, another shorter, and another taller. forming a range that, for the first time, allows many girls to see something closer to reality in the toy they hold in their hands. The way the change is introduced is very revealing from an entrepreneurial point of view. Mattel does not replace the classic Barbie with the new bodies, does not eliminate her to impose a new era, but decides to allow her to coexist with her different versions, as if accepting that its original icon still has a place in the collective memory, while wanting to create space for other representations that respond better to current expectations. It is a portfolio strategy within the product itself. Instead of a single Barbie, there is now a family of Barbies with different bodies, connected by the same brand but carrying new meanings. It is a way of reducing the risk of a radical break without giving up the boldness that the moment demands. The launch is not improvised. There is a meticulously designed campaign, magazine covers, interviews, explanatory videos, and a narrative making it clear that the change is not a publicity trick, but the response to a social conversation that had been growing for years. Mattel chooses to show the process, explaining how they have listened to mothers, girls, and experts, how they have tested designs, and how they reached the conclusion that Barbie can no longer represent only one type of body. That transparency breaks, in part, the distance between the large corporation and the consumer, turning the decision into a gesture of strategic humility. The brand admits that it has learned, that it has reviewed its own dogmas, and that it is willing to change. The initial reactions are intense and very diverse. One part of the public celebrates the move as a necessary step forward, a sign that even the most rigid icons can be updated when they pay attention to what is happening in the streets. Mothers and fathers share photos of the new dolls on social media, talking about daughters who say, "She looks like me," or "She looks like my friend," and those testimonies move those inside the company who have fought for years to broaden the spectrum of representation. Another part of the public, however, feels reluctant, believing that the toy is being politicized, or that the traditional Barbie was already part of a beloved imaginary world that did not need such profound changes. That division was predictable and, in fact, confirms that the move is not cosmetic, because real transformations always generate resistance. In business terms, the Fashionistas line brings more than media visibility. The variety of bodies, skin tones, and styles multiplies the product offering, without it being perceived as repetition, which favors collecting and renewal. Each doll becomes a piece of a larger mosaic, a catalog that no longer relies on the same body with a different dress, but begins to speak of identities, personalities, and different stories. From a product design perspective, this means an important logistical challenge. New molds, new production lines, new quality controls, and at the same time, the need to maintain costs at a level that allows the brand to remain competitive in price. The symbolic impact goes even further. In conversations about childhood and self-esteem, Barbie stops being only the example used to illustrate what was wrong with beauty standards and becomes a case study on how a brand can change direction when it acknowledges its mistakes. Many opinion pieces that had harshly criticized the doll years earlier begin to qualify their positions, appreciating the fact that a global company, used to earning money with an old model, is willing to take the risk of modifying its central product even knowing that it may lose part of its more conservative base. For the girls, who in the end are the center of this entire story, the change is experienced differently, less intellectually, and much more directly. The scene repeats itself in stores and homes. A girl stops in front of the shelf and no longer sees an army of identical bodies, but a group of dolls in which, suddenly, there is curly hair, darker skin, stronger legs, different heights. She does not need to read a press release to understand what is happening. It is enough to feel that she has more options, that she can choose the doll that seems closest, most interesting, or most similar to the people she loves. That moment, which lasts only a few seconds, contains years of strategic work and internal change. It is important to highlight that the Fashionistas line does not solve all criticisms or turn Barbie into a perfect brand, but it does mark a before and after in its relationship with the topic of body and visual diversity. There is still a long way to go. Open debates remain. Tensions persist between stylized fantasy and realistic representation. However, the direction of the movement is clear. From this point on, it will no longer be possible to think of Barbie as a single, monolithic figure. The doll has entered, at last, a phase of controlled plurality. where the challenge is to expand the range without losing brand coherence. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, what Mattel does during this stage offers several powerful lessons. The first is that listening to the market does not mean blindly following every demand, but identifying those criticisms that endanger the deep meaning of your product and addressing them with forceful action. The second is that touching the heart of a brand can be a strategy for survival, not an act of destruction, as long as it is done with a long-term vision and careful execution. The third is that in a world where consumers are more informed and connected than ever, superficial gestures are easily detected, meaning that the changes that truly generate impact require structural commitments, such as investing in new designs, new production lines, and new ways of telling the brand's own story. With Fashionistas, Barbie once again appears on covers, in debates, and in conversations, but this time not only as a symbol of a problem, but as an example of a serious attempt at adaptation. That new energy opens the door to going beyond the body, to thinking about other forms of inclusion that do not limit themselves to physical appearance, and prepares the ground for the brand to dare to represent realities that, for decades, were completely absent from the toy aisle. From here on, the question is no longer whether Barbie will dare to be different, but to what extent she is willing to approach the real lives of those who have played with her for generations. Inclusive Barbie. When the Fashionistas line begins to settle into the market and the new silhouettes stop being a media novelty and become a normal part of the catalog, an idea emerges within Mattel that goes one step further beyond general physical appearance. If the doll intends to represent the girls of today, it is not enough to offer different bodies and different skin colors. It is necessary to look at reality with more detail and ask who is still being left outside the map. In many homes, there are girls who use hearing devices, who use a wheelchair, who have vitiligo, who live with a prosthetic limb or with a chronic illness, and none of them have been clearly represented in the toy aisle. The challenge is no longer only stylistic, it is profoundly human. In that context, a new wave of releases begins to take shape, understanding inclusion as something more specific. Barbie dolls in wheelchairs appear, designed with a structure that truly works, with ramps and adapted accessories, not as a simple decorative element placed in the back of the box. A doll with a prosthetic leg arrives, created in collaboration with people who use real prosthetic limbs so that the dimensions, the angle, and the fit are believable. A Barbie doll with vitiligo is incorporated, with skin patterns carefully designed so they do not look like an exotic ornament, but rather a respectful representation of a visible condition. Later on, a doll with hearing devices appears, and another that wears a glucose monitor on her arm, reflecting the experience of those who live with type 1 diabetes. Each one of these figures is accompanied by a consultation process with doctors, patient associations, and people who live these daily realities in first person. From the point of view of entrepreneurship, this movement has important strategic depth. Mattel understands that it is no longer enough to join the discourse of diversity in a generic way, because the current consumer distinguishes very well between a superficial gesture and work that has been done with rigor. That is why, behind each inclusive Barbie doll, there are hours of meetings with specialists who correct details, adjust designs, and explain which elements are essential so that a girl who lives in that situation truly recognizes herself in the toy. It is not about adding a hearing device because it looks good in marketing, but about reflecting how it is inserted, what its real appearance is, and how it integrates into the life of someone who uses it every day. The stories that begin to reach the company after these releases confirm that the decision is moving in the right direction. Parents send emails, videos, and social media posts, sharing that their daughters, upon seeing the doll in a wheelchair or with vitiligo, have said for the first time, "She is like me," not with shame, but with a quiet sense of pride. For many of those girls, simply finding their reality in a massive and aspirational product works like a kind of silent validation. If Barbie can have a prosthetic limb, or a hearing device, or different skin, then that characteristic stops being something that separates them from the rest and becomes just another part of their identity. At the same time, these dolls play a crucial role in the informal education of those children who do not have these conditions. Playing with a Barbie doll with a glucose monitor can spark conversations at home about what it means to live with diabetes, or why a classmate injects insulin. A Barbie doll with hearing devices can make inclusion in the classroom more natural, because children have already seen a toy that represents that reality without dramatizing it. The doll becomes a bridge between different life experiences, a tool that opens the door to empathy without falling into the heavy didactic tone that often bores the youngest ones. In brand terms, this shift towards specific representation also responds to a new consumer sensitivity that values companies that assume an authentic commitment to certain communities. However, there is an important nuance. If the gesture were perceived as opportunistic, the effect would be the opposite of what is intended. Mattel seems to understand this and extends the logic of inclusion beyond the physical doll, incorporating these models into educational materials, online videos, and campaigns that speak about acceptance, respect, and diversity in a relatable language. The brand begins to narrate itself as an actor committed to the visibility of different realities, not as a simple manufacturer of plastic products. This phase also forces the traditional marketing of Barbie to be reimagined. For decades, the advertisements had focused on perfection, on impeccable homes, ideal parties, and lives polished to the extreme. Introducing a Barbie doll in a wheelchair or with a prosthetic limb breaks that mold and raises a deeper question. How do you sell an aspirational life without erasing difficulties, without disguising differences? The answer appears in campaigns where inclusion is presented naturally, without dramatizing and without infantilizing the people represented. Barbie continues to be a symbol of possibility. But now that possibility does not rely on fitting into a single mold, but instead on accepting that every body and every condition can be the starting point for a full life. From an internal perspective, this path toward inclusion also transforms the culture of the company. The design and marketing teams begin working with external consultants, with people who might never have entered a Mattel product room in earlier eras. Spaces open up to listen to disability activists, mental health experts, and community leaders who present strong criticism when something does not seem appropriate to them. This interaction can be uncomfortable, but it forces the company to abandon autopilot mode and review every decision through a new filter. What message does it send? Who does it include? And who might it leave out? For an entrepreneur observing this evolution from the outside, the story offers a very clear lesson. Inclusion is not a trend that can be solved with a single gesture, but a continuous process that requires opening the company to external perspectives, accepting mistakes, correcting them, and moving forward. Linearity disappears. A doll that triumphs in one community may generate debate in another. A detail that seemed correct 5 years ago may fall short today. Navigating that terrain requires humility, patience, and a genuine will to serve communities that for a long time felt ignored or caricatured. Over time, the sum of diverse bodies, visible health conditions, and distinct lifestyles begins to build a mosaic in which Barbie stops being a symbol of unreachable perfection and moves closer, little by little, to the complexity of real life. The fantasy remains present because there are still outfits, houses, and professions that awaken the desire to imagine. But the base upon which that fantasy is built is broader, more inclusive, and more honest. And while the brand works on this human dimension in the physical toy, another transformation is taking shape in parallel, in a different terrain: content, screens, and audiovisual stories, where Barbie prepares to leap again and establish herself as a full-fledged character within the universe of entertainment. From toy to multimedia franchise, as digital presence begins to permeate everyday life and screens become the main space where children consume stories, Mattel understands that it depends too heavily on a business model anchored to plastic, to the physical shelf, and to the temporality of holiday campaigns. The competition is no longer only an alternative doll, but YouTube channels, animated series, video games, mobile applications, and an audiovisual culture that never rests. In that scenario, Barbie faces a new kind of challenge. If she wants to remain relevant, she has to stop living only in the three-dimensional plane and transform into a character capable of inhabiting complete narratives, with arcs, personalities, and worlds of her own. It is the moment in which the brand begins to understand itself not as a product, but as an intellectual property with the potential to expand far beyond the toy. This transition begins in a relatively timid way in the 1990s, when the first direct-to-video films starring Barbie appear, stories that combine ballet, classic tales and magical environments that fit with the idea of childhood fantasy of the time. What at first seemed like an almost anecdotal extension of the brand soon reveals an interesting behavior. The girls who watch the films return to the toy with more intensity. They ask for the dresses that appear in the story. They recreate scenes in front of the mirror. They sing the songs and repeat the choreographies. Mattel detects that the screen and the toy feed each other, that each format strengthens the other, and that, when Barbie acquires voice, movement, and an emotional narrative, the play experience expands in a significant way. As the years pass, the films stop being an occasional complement and transform into a stable production line, with annual releases distributed on digital video discs and, later on digital platforms. Each film brings with it a message, a visual universe, and a thematic collection. Princesses, mermaids, dancers, modern heroines, futuristic settings, or reinvented tales. From the business point of view, this opens a virtuous cycle. The film is sold. The associated doll line is sold. Accessories inspired by the wardrobe are sold, and the collective imagination around the brand expands. What was previously simply a doll with different professions becomes a multifaceted character who can live adventures in any time or imaginable world. When the rise of the internet arrives, Mattel decides to reinforce this strategy with its own digital content. Interactive websites appear where girls can play at dressing Barbie, decorating rooms, solving simple missions, or watching small animated clips. Later, the official channels on YouTube appear, especially Barbie Vlogs, a series in video blog format where the doll speaks directly to the camera as if she were a real content creator. In these videos, Barbie appears approachable. She reflects on friendship, self-esteem, creativity, and everyday challenges. The decision is brilliant because it places the doll in a language typical of the generation growing up on social networks, without the need for parents to buy a new physical product. Barbie begins to behave like an influencer, with brief messages, light animation, and a conversational style that connects her with audiences who may no longer buy so many dolls, but do consume hours of online content. The leap into video games also expands the reach of the brand. Although many of the first proposals are simple, focused on fashion, dance, or the resolution of small challenges, they function as an entry point for girls who spend much of their time on electronic devices. Even if the technical level of those games does not compete with the major titles in the market, they fulfill an essential function, keeping Barbie active in the new scenarios where the emotional bonds of young audiences are formed. In the field of entrepreneurship, this expansion illustrates a key concept. Relevance is not preserved by refusing change, but by accompanying users into the territories where they spend their time, adapting to the formats they consider natural. The most interesting aspect of this stage is that Mattel begins to think of itself as an entertainment company, not as a toy producer. That shift in mentality is fundamental to understanding what will happen years later. A brand that understands its narrative potential can sell a doll, but it can also sell a story, a film, a song, a video game, or a web series. A brand that remains trapped in a single format, on the other hand, runs the risk of becoming a symbol of the past. Barbie, during these years, moves toward that hybrid model in which the physical doll is only one more expression of a much broader universe. The development of secondary characters also plays a central role in this multimedia expansion. Friends, family members, pets, and antagonists begin to acquire their own identity. They are given roles, styles, and voices. This does not happen by chance. Allowing Barbie to coexist with other characters makes the narrative richer and allows the audiovisual content to explore more complex dynamics. The stories stop being monologues focused solely on her and transform into choral narratives, full of interaction, humor, and small lessons. And when the secondary characters generate enough interest, Mattel can turn them into products of their own, expanding the line without saturating the protagonist. On a cultural level, this phase also marks a change. Barbie stops being only an aspirational projection and becomes a character with nuances, capable of having doubts, making mistakes, learning new things, and showing different facets of her personality. In the vlogs and in the animated series, the doll talks about fears, nerves, insecurities, creativity, or social pressure, topics that would never have appeared in the television advertisements of the 1980s. This more human and reflective version of Barbie brings the brand closer to new generations, who value content with messages of authenticity and emotional well-being. Over time, this multimedia path reaches a maturity that transforms the company's global strategy. Mattel begins to think of Barbie as a franchise in the style of the great intellectual properties of entertainment, with the potential to extend toward more ambitious projects. The direct-to-video films had proven that there was demand. The videos on YouTube had confirmed that the doll could adapt to digital language, and the thematic product lines showed that coherent narratives crossing between the toy and the screen were possible. Only one bigger step was missing, one that would take this story to a new level of cultural impact. And that step, as we now know from our current perspective, was very close to arriving, ready to transform this entire evolution into a cinematic bet that would forever change the way the world would see Barbie and Mattel. The Masterstroke, the 2023 film. When Mattel entered the 2022, after years of internal reconstruction, narrative repositioning, and a firm path toward diversity, an idea emerged that at first seemed so risky it split entire rooms of executives, bringing Barbie to the big screen in a live-action film, with real actors, a completely new story, and a tone that did not imitate the children's productions the brand had released for years. The proposal was not conceived as a mere nostalgic exercise, nor as an isolated experiment, but as an opportunity to turn Barbie into a cultural phenomenon capable of speaking not only to young girls, but also to adults, cinephiles, critics, and generations who had grown up with the doll and now looked at the world with doubts, irony, and new sensibilities. The idea began taking shape in internal discussions where Mattel no longer thought of itself as a toy manufacturer, but as an entertainment studio. The company had watched how the intellectual properties of other corporations were being transformed into multi-million-dollar cinematic universes, and realized that its own catalog contained enormous narrative potential if handled with boldness and genuine creative talent. However, Barbie was not an easy character to adapt. Her image carried decades of meanings, controversies, affection, criticism, and stereotypes that could easily destroy a film project if not approached intelligently. The key, therefore, was to find someone capable of seeing in the doll not merely a consumer icon, but a cultural symbol complex enough to build a contemporary, sharp, and relevant story around. That person emerged in the figure of Greta Gerwig, a director known for deeply human projects filled with sensitivity, intelligent humor, and a critical lens on identity and femininity. Her name surprised many in the industry, because her profile did not fit at all with the typical imagination of a toy-based film. And it was precisely for that reason that Mattel chose to take the gamble. A director outside the world of children's entertainment would have the necessary distance to rethink the myth from scratch. Alongside her came Margot Robbie, who not only starred in the project but also served as a producer through her own company, contributing a strategic vision that blended aesthetic elegance with commercial intuition. The union of the two transformed the film into a landscape of possibilities no one would have imagined just a few years earlier. When the project became public, the impact was immediate. The media, Gerwig's followers, Robbie's fans, and Barbie nostalgics all began asking what kind of film could emerge from such a combination. This was not a discrete product destined for a quiet release on streaming platforms. It was a major production aiming to fill movie theaters and become one of the cultural events of the year. From the beginning, it was clear that the film would not pursue a complacent tone. There would be self-aware humor, meta-references, reflections on female ideals, and a visual style blending artificiality and emotion in a completely new way. As production advanced, Mattel prepared one of the most ambitious marketing campaigns in its history. The strategy did not rely solely on trailers or colorful posters, but on transforming Barbie into an omnipresent pop culture phenomenon. Collaborations multiplied. Fashion brands launched capsule collections inspired by the film. Airlines painted parts of their planes in vibrant pink tones. Fast food chains created themed menus, and even lodging platforms recreated Barbie's house in real locations, so fans could enjoy an immersive experience. The campaign took the global audience by surprise, turning streets, store windows, and social platforms into an environment that looked as if it had been pulled directly out of Barbie Land. The official trailer confirmed a tone no one had expected from a product associated with such a famous doll. Sharp humor, meticulously crafted aesthetics, pastel tones coexisting with critical commentary, and performances embracing the absurd and the reflective simultaneously. As the release date approached, expectations grew beyond anything analysts had predicted. Barbie, who for decades had been the center of debates about beauty, femininity, and consumer culture, now returned, wrapped in a bold, self-aware narrative that appealed not only to those who had grown up with her, but also to those who had criticized her for years. The premiere marked a before and after moment for Mattel. Theaters filled across the world, social media burst with images of spectators dressed in pink, and early reviews highlighted the boldness of the script, the originality of the visuals, and the film's ability to address profound themes without losing lightness. What could have been a purely commercial operation became a socio-cultural event, mixing reflection, humor, nostalgia, spectacle, and a complex portrait of contemporary identity. The production design, Robbie's performance, Ryan Gosling's presence as Ken, and Gerwig's razor-sharp dialogue generated a phenomenon that crossed generations and social contexts. From a business perspective, the film surpassed every previous expectation. It earned over $1 billion at the global box office, becoming one of the most successful productions of its year, and, at that moment, the highest-grossing film ever directed by a woman. That achievement did not merely revive the Barbie brand. It offered Mattel definitive validation to move forward with a strategy it had been developing for years, transforming itself into a transversal entertainment studio capable of competing in the cinematic arena with major franchises. The film's success demonstrated that Barbie was larger than her own mold, that she could support complex arguments, adult conversations, and an artistic impact that transcended the toy. For popular culture, the effect was equally significant. The film sparked debates about gender, identity, stereotypes, and social expectations, debates that took place on social media, in university classrooms, and in informal conversations, with a level of intensity that surprised even the screenwriters. Barbie ceased to be a passive symbol and became a point of departure, an excuse to analyze how society constructs ideas of beauty, power, success, and belonging. The film did not offer closed answers. Instead, it invited reflection, contradiction, and dialogue, a gesture that reinforced its impact far beyond entertainment. The Barbie 2023 phenomenon also had a direct effect on the brand's sales. Dolls once again became objects of desire, not only among young girls, but also among adults seeking collectible items, special editions, and products tied to the film's aesthetic. The commercial impact was accompanied by an emotional resurgence, because Barbie stopped being a relic of the past and became something that belonged squarely to the present, capable of reinventing itself, laughing at itself, and offering new interpretations. Through its cinematic experience, Mattel discovered a powerful formula. Barbie's value does not lie solely in her accessories or dream houses, but in the ability to tell stories that connect with real emotions. And that understanding opened an entirely new path, one the company is already preparing to travel, with more projects, more collaborations, and more universes ready to be developed both on screen and beyond it. The cultural and economic impact. When the phenomenon of 2023 begins to settle and the lights of the premiere give way to a more deliberate conversation, Barbie once again occupies a place she had held in other eras, but now with a different density. She becomes a cultural thermometer, a reflection of what a society expects, criticizes, celebrates, and discusses about itself. The film acts as a catalyst, but the true impact emerges when the entire brand, in all its dimensions, toy, content, values, aesthetics, nostalgia, and future, is reconfigured in the collective mind. Mattel understands that what it has achieved is not only a box office success, it has reopened a global dialogue about identity, femininity, capitalism, aspirations, and the contradictions that accompany brands that have spent more than half a century in the public imagination. This cultural impact does not manifest only in headlines. It is visible in classrooms, where teachers analyze the film as a contemporary study of gender construction. It is visible on social networks, where users of different generations reinterpret the figure of Barbie from perspectives that range from irony to vindication. It is visible in domestic conversations, where parents debate what it means today to give a doll to a girl or to a boy. And it is visible even in the way other brands begin to revise their own narrative to adapt to a world that demands greater self-awareness and a stronger capacity for self-criticism. At the same time, the economic impact is not limited to a temporary surge. The film generates a domino effect that rekindles demand for dolls linked to the cinematic aesthetic, but it also increases the value of older editions, drives fashion collaborations, expands Barbie's presence in advertising, in editorial projects, in luxury collections, and in products that had never before been associated with the brand. Suddenly, Barbie is not only a toy sold in children's stores, but a piece that can appear on a runway, star in a high-end shop window, or be featured at an artistic event without seeming out of place. The brand crosses generations of consumers, each with its own emotional connection, and that cross-generational reach translates into an unusual commercial strength for a product that was born in 1959. In parallel, Mattel uses this momentum to strengthen a business model that had been taking shape for years beneath the surface. The idea that the company can function as an incubator of intellectual properties, ready to expand into cinema, television, video games, and global advertising. Barbie becomes, in this sense, the perfect case study to show shareholders and the industry what the company is capable of achieving when it combines tradition, creative risk, and strategic investment. The performance of the film legitimizes future decisions, opens doors to projects that previously seemed too ambitious, and allows Mattel to position itself as a relevant player in the entertainment industry, not only in the toy sector. However, the cultural impact also brings responsibilities. Barbie now finds herself under a broader and more intense spotlight than ever before, observed by analysts who evaluate every step the brand takes with a mixture of anticipation and demand. Contemporary society does not allow brands to navigate contradictory discourses without facing consequences, which means the company must sustain with coherence what it has declared in its products and in its audiovisual narrative. It is no longer enough to release diverse dolls or create reflective content. The public expects consistency, rigor, and a constant willingness to evolve. This forces Mattel to examine its production lines, communication strategies, and creative decisions with a level of detail it had probably never faced in any previous stage. The debates that arise around Barbie during this period are especially interesting because they reveal something that very few brands achieve. People speak about her as if she were a person. They discuss whether her narrative decisions are well chosen, whether her representation is fair, whether her influence is positive or problematic, whether the 2023 film exaggerates, succeeds, or simplifies certain social issues. Barbie becomes a mirror that allows society to project concerns, frustrations, desires, and contradictions. This is not a coincidence. It happens when a product stops being an object and becomes a multifaceted symbol capable of meaning different things depending on who is looking. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this stage offers a valuable lesson. When a brand manages to enter the cultural debate, its power transcends any advertising campaign. From that moment on, it is the public who creates meanings, who rewrites the story, who projects interpretations, and who sustains the symbolic value of the product. It is a phenomenon that very few companies experience, and Mattel, aware of its exceptional nature, begins to act as the manager of a cultural heritage as much as of a commercial property. At the same time, Barbie becomes an emblematic case of how a brand can survive its own contradictions. For decades, the doll was criticized for promoting a narrow beauty ideal, for representing a model of femininity tied to consumption, for simplifying the role of women in society. Today, with its work on inclusion, with the Fashionistas line, with the representation of different physical conditions, and with the reflective message of the film, Barbie shows that it is possible to revisit the past without denying it, to adapt without erasing history, and to reformulate an icon without destroying it. This gradual transformation demonstrates that long-standing brands do not survive by remaining immovable, but by interpreting the world in each era, even when that interpretation requires uncomfortable decisions or departures from tradition. Global sales respond to this renewed coherence. The dolls experience sustained growth, collaborations multiply, and the cultural prestige of the brand is revitalized, attracting both new generations and adults who look at Barbie again with a mixture of irony and renewed affection. But perhaps the most important shift is that the conversation is no longer about whether Barbie remains relevant, but rather about the direction she will take in the coming years, and what new narratives will be built around a symbol that has proven capable of reinventing itself, even when it seemed to have exhausted all possibilities. At this point in the story, with the brand culturally stronger than it has been in a long time, the question is no longer whether Barbie will manage to stay alive. It becomes how she will use this new energy to project herself toward the future, a future in which entertainment, representation, and innovation intertwine as indispensable pillars for any project that seeks to endure. From that solid foundation, the next stage appears as an expansion into territories that, for decades, had been completely out of reach for a toy transformed into a myth. The future of Barbie. When Barbie reaches this level of cultural and business maturity after an evolution shaped by aesthetic changes, social debates, strategic reinventions, and a film that completely redefined her place in the global imagination, the question echoing through the offices of Mattel is no longer whether the brand will remain alive, but what form it will take in the coming decades. The challenge is no longer to reactively adapt to a changing world, but to anticipate those changes with intelligence, sensitivity, and creative vision. Barbie has survived internal crises, fierce competitors, technological transformations, and deep criticism about her meaning. Now she enters a stage in which each decision can determine not only her commercial relevance, but her role as a cultural symbol in a time that evolves at remarkable speed. The first thing noticeable in this new phase is a clear intention to consolidate the brand as a global franchise capable of expanding into areas that once seemed reserved for entertainment giants. Mattel no longer conceives of Barbie as a single product, but as an ecosystem. Dolls, series, films, video games, fashion collaborations, physical experiences, themed events, temporary parks, and even adult-oriented products that reinterpret the doll's iconic aesthetic with an ironic or sophisticated twist. This diversification responds to a profound change in contemporary consumer habits, where the strongest brands are those that integrate seamlessly into multiple aspects of everyday life, not only on a specific shelf. Within this context, one of the most promising paths is the creation of more audiovisual content. Mattel has learned that the best way to bring Barbie to life in the public's mind is through stories, not only physical objects. The 2023 film opened an entirely new horizon and proved that the brand can sustain complex projects with layers of meaning for both adults and children, with their own style and with a language that moves away from traditional marketing. This lesson paves the way for potential new films, animated series with deeper narratives, and even initiatives that explore the Barbie universe from unexpected angles, such as documentaries, spin-offs focused on secondary characters, or hybrid projects mixing animation with live action. Meanwhile, the educational dimension is gaining strength within the company's strategy. For years, Barbie was criticized for being associated with superficial messages or simplifications of the female experience. Now Mattel sees the opportunity to turn that past into a starting point for initiatives that encourage creativity, critical thinking, and personal confidence. This translates into educational materials, collaborations with organizations dedicated to equal opportunities, programs that promote the presence of girls in science, technology, and leadership, and content designed to support the emotional challenges of contemporary childhood. The goal is not to transform Barbie into a moralistic figure, but into a tool that helps explore complex themes with an approachable and accessible tone. At the same time, inclusion remains a non-negotiable pillar of this new era. Dolls with hearing aids, prosthetics, vitiligo, or wheelchairs were just the beginning of a path with plenty of room to grow. Mattel understands that diversity cannot be limited to a handful of physical differences or aesthetic variations. It must expand into narratives that include different cultural backgrounds, modern family structures, broader gender identities, and realities that authentically reflect the lives of millions of children around the world. This approach requires constant research, consultation, sensitivity, and active listening, because society changes quickly, and expectations around representation change with it. On another front, digitalization offers opportunities that 10 years ago would have seemed like science fiction. The rise of virtual worlds, the development of immersive experiences, the evolution of artificial intelligence, and the consolidation of interactive platforms make it possible to imagine a Barbie who does not live only in a box or on a cinema screen, but in digital spaces where users can interact with her, accompany her through personalized stories, or build their own narrative universes. It is likely that the future will bring more complex video games, gamified educational platforms, apps integrating augmented reality, or even virtual experiences allowing children to step into Barbie land with full immersion. This digital path, however, does not imply abandoning the physical toy. Barbie was born as a tangible object, and that quality will always carry an emotional value no screen can replace. What we can expect is a smoother integration between the physical and digital worlds, where dolls become gateways to broader narratives, where accessories interact with apps, or where the stories told in video games influence new toy collections. This hybrid model promises to extend the brand's relevance in a world where attention is easily scattered. Another key element of Barbie's future is her relationship with fashion, a bond that has shaped her identity since the very beginning. Collaborations with designers, once nothing more than gestures of prestige, now become creative laboratories where silhouettes, colors, and styles are reinvented. The Barbie universe lends itself to endless reinterpretations because it combines nostalgia, iconic aesthetics, and visual flexibility, making it a perfect canvas for emerging designers, luxury houses, and mainstream brands to experiment. This connection with fashion not only reinforces the doll's cultural dimension, but also keeps her on the radar of young adults who see Barbie as an ironic, pop, kitsch, or elegant symbol, depending on the lens through which they observe her. As all this unfolds, Mattel faces an inevitable challenge: managing public expectations. After the overwhelming success of the film, audiences expect moves that match that impact, decisions that avoid being conservative or repetitive. The brand must balance respect for its legacy with the ability to surprise, a task that demands strategic intelligence, creative boldness, and a deep understanding of the cultural context. Barbie can no longer afford to ignore social conversations because she sits at their center. Nor can she fall into the trap of repeating the formula that worked in 2023, because the audience quickly notices when a brand tries to replicate a success without offering anything new. Barbie's true strength, looking ahead, lies in her ability to embrace complexity. She has gone from being a simple toy to a cultural mirror, from being a criticized symbol to becoming an example of reinvention, from inhabiting a rigid mold to multiplying into bodies, skins, stories, and screens. Her journey proves that she can evolve without losing her identity, that she can live in both the past and the future, and that her resilience depends not on staying the same, but on listening, learning, and transforming. And as Mattel plans its next moves, the lingering question is not what future awaits Barbie, but how many versions of the future a brand born in 1959 can inhabit at the same time, a brand that, more than 60 years later, continues to ignite conversations, emotions, debates, and expectations around the world. That is the clearest sign that her story is far from ending. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of Barbie, a brand that has reinvented itself in every era. If you enjoyed this documentary, I would love to hear from you in the comments and learn which part surprised you the most. Don't forget to subscribe so we can continue exploring new stories of entrepreneurship and evolution. Have a good night.